Joining us to discuss, from battery minerals to software, GM's approach to a resilient supply chain. Please welcome Senior Vice President, Global Chief Procurement and Supply Chain Officer for General Motors, Shilpan Amin. Moderated by Executive Director of SAFE Center for Critical Minerals Strategy, Abigail Hunter.
Hello again. The last time I was up here, we were deep on the weeds of extraction, refining, chemical processing, accessing material from hard rock and brine. But now I invite you to join me on the other end of the supply chain, where we can think through what we talked about on our last panel that I moderated, where if nobody buys the material that we're producing, no one qualifies it, then what's all of the increased supply for? Cars are where it really all comes together, integrating dozens of critical minerals in different forms to compete in one of the most innovative and demanding markets of the world, and as we heard before, at a very, very competitive scale. So the real question that we'll be diving into on this panel with General Motors is how to make a mine-to-market supply chain actually work in process, especially given the changing policy environment at home, but also internationally. Shilpan, you took the role as Global Chief Procurement and Supply Chain Officer in April of 2025, right after the China MOFCOM export controls on April 4th. That is quite the onboarding week for you.
Lucky me.
You've said that the supply chain risks are one of the things that really keeps you up at night. But GM has been really building towards a resilient domestic critical minerals and regional critical minerals supply chain since 2021 across multiple investments and strategic partnerships.
Yeah.
So how would you characterize where GM stands today, and what's your benchmark for success so that you can get some more sleep at night?
Well, I fall into luck. My first round when I ran global purchasing and supply chain for General Motors was back in 2020. As we came into COVID, I think 3 months after I took the job. And then as we were coming out of COVID, we had the semiconductor crisis of 2021. And it seemed like it's been ongoing ever since. The good thing, though, and our CEO, Mary Barra, always says, do not let a crisis go to waste. In the first round, when we were going through the semiconductor shortages of 2021, we learned a lot about where our semiconductors come from. At that time, we actually didn't buy a semiconductor. It was all done through our tiered supply base. And there was a couple things we put in place back then. One is we have to know what the value chain looks like. We have to be able to dig deeper past our tier ones and what we reference until you see dirt and water. So we spent a lot of time and created tools and digital mapping to really map out our value chain down to dirt and water. And what we wanted to learn from the crisis of the past were, how do you ensure that we have a continued flow of material? We changed our mindset back then from what we were chasing, this globalization of the automotive industry, where we were chasing the lowest cost place to produce parts around the world. In 2020 and 2021, the equation changed when you start thinking of it as, what is the cost of not having a part? How quickly do we burn down our reserves when we can't produce? And when you change your mindset like that, it helps you realize that you've got to diversify your supply chain. You've got to shift our mindset into what we call our buy where we build to ensure the big hubs of operations have continuity independent of what's happening everywhere else in the world. And so that really set the foundation toward our resiliency back in 2020 and 2021.
And a lot of companies made these commitments around that time, having experienced the supply chain crunches and the pandemic and the semiconductor challenges. Yeah. But what made you guys stick with it? Especially, cost is king in so many manufactured goods. In the face of low cost opportunities, how did you continue to invest in these alternatives?
So we had our entire leadership team engaged in resetting our supply chain philosophy, including our board of directors that were heavily engaged into how are you building resiliency. And what we recognized was the initial mover is going to have a more difficult time to make the changes. But we also recognized that if you don't start now, you're going to put yourself exposed into the future. And let me take you back to semiconductors. When we were looking for semiconductors around the world, we know, to create a new fab, it was going to take 3-4 years. Our company couldn't survive without operating our manufacturing facilities for that long. And as you think about even critical minerals, to set up a mine, set up processing, get automotive quality grade material out, validating it into our products, it's a really long time. And we started making the change there to say, let's build the resiliency. And we had the support of our senior leadership team and our board that it may be a cost premium. It was an easy decision, though, when you factor in if the insurance policy behind it of, if you don't build, you start burning down millions of dollars an hour, and that extra dollar you're saving for that mineral isn't worth the savings. And so we had the entire top leadership support. To be honest, that's not enough. It takes a full cultural shift, internal and external. It takes everyone that's been building their capabilities for years around understand the material cost and the cost drivers and get to the lowest total enterprise cost decision and make your decisions based on that. To say, change that into diversification matters and resiliency matters, and how do you build the factors of the cost of not having materials and the lead times associated, find and substitutes play a factor in how you make decisions. And so we had to have this consistent push with the culture. I think the other part that was probably even more difficult than everything was, how do you bring your partners along with you? How do you engage with your supply base? And we've been working on strong supplier relations for a really long time, for over a decade. We're proud about the progress we've made with supplier relations, where we have some of our highest scores, the highest domestic scores in the industry. And we ask them to come to the table and take that leap of faith with us, because we can give them longevity in awarding contracts. We could give them multi-generation, and what we needed from them is building assurances in our supply chain. And so it took a lot of strategic investments that may not have had all the right information on the paper to make a financial decision at that time, but it took that partnership and that collaboration for us to recognize, if we do this right, we'll build an affordable, resilient, competitive supply chain that will change the way our operations run.
I have many, many recommendations for government, but my #1 recommendation for industry is always moving the procurement team closer to the C-suite to be able to think more strategically about this, but hadn't dawned on me needing to kind of translate that all the way down, your suppliers as well. You said, these investments make sense because you're investing for the long term, and so it's interesting you began kind of thinking about this resiliency half a decade ago, and then we had, as mentioned in the opening, this really disruptive moment on April 4th with the MOFCOM export controls. And so I want to ask you to kind of share with the audience, what was that like? The investments you had made take time. Not all of them were online there for you to respond immediately and have those assurances. So how did you work with the US government to triangulate, your dwindling inventories and, what led to the detente that we're in right now?
So I think a couple of factors come together. Building relationships much ahead of when you ever need it. And having that supplier relationship mattered. Building the know-how into what your supply chain looks like so you can react quickly. In a crisis, every minute matters. And your ability to get ahead of anyone else creates the difference of operating and not operating. And so because we had our supply chain mapped out, because we understood where the minerals existed around the world and who are supplier partners that have capacity and capabilities around the world, because we made early strategic investments when no one else could, no one else would, across industries, not just the automotive industry, in places on heavy rare earth elements with MP materials. And we paid a premium to do so because that was our commitment to help them build scale to bring affordability back down. All those pieces come together. And we were able to bring all the teams in, be very transparent of where our shortages were, find solutions together where we could keep our operations running. I think we were the only OEM that did not take any downtime due to all the crises, whether it was in heavy rare earth export controls or even with the Nexperia semiconductor crisis that was happening at the same time.
So essentially, it pays to do your homework in advance, study for the exam, not the night before, but like the entire semester, so that you can actually deal with the challenges as they pop up. You've said we need to think about these supply chains, not necessarily in securing isolated links, but thinking through the entire loop: mining, refining, manufacturing, assembly, all the way to fabrication, so that materials can become magnets, motors, battery packs, microchips in the US. I'm fully on board with you. That's very ambitious, though, compared to just diversifying the supply chains. So maybe you can reflect upon where we've made progress in those nodes that are genuinely robust and where OEMs are most exposed. You know, is it geography? Is it single point of failure, processing capacity, qualification? Where should we be focusing to kind of have that full loop that you're envisioning?
So one piece of it is understanding what drives the supply chain, what enables the investments to be made, what type of scale you need to bring affordability, and how you could play a piece of that puzzle. For us, there was a couple of things that we knew General Motors could bring to the table. As you mentioned, kind of long-term stability, long-term contractual volumes that give you a starting point for consideration. Our commitment was take out the complexity, and we looked at how do you actually build less variance of requirements and quality of parts that you need more consistently with things that could be flexible in operations across adjacent industries. Even though the automotive grades tend to be higher requirements, it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be isolated processes. And so as we did our part to bring the complexity down, and we've been building supplier capabilities for a long time, even beyond critical minerals and semiconductors. What we also knew through that partnership is having your first customer matters. Because this takes that leap of faith by both the supply side and the demand side of making these investments before anyone else knows that they need them. And having that first movers gives you the benefit that when others realize they're in need, you're there to supply. And if you can go to a customer and say, and by the way, General Motors is my customer, and we have been validated by General Motors, or even better yet, we're in production with General Motors, it really opens up your credibility as a company to have higher consideration for all these other companies that are thinking of doing the same. And so what we did across our supply base is work on this consolidation, consistency, building up our total volumes. We weren't actually buying critical minerals directly for our use. We changed that so we can leverage the scale across all of our operations to be able to give that commitment to the companies that we were investing with.
And, you know, coming from a world where I spend a lot of time going to mining conferences, I have to say, being able to say General Motors is your customer is quite the premium. When you walk into the Prospectors and Developers Association conference or any mining conference, you're the most popular girl at the dance, right? Everybody wants to have GM as their customer, particularly with a long-term offtake that can help with their financials, their investability, their credibility in the market, as we're standing up what is, in some cases, still a very nascent industry at home and in allied nations. You've done this with a lot of partners, but there's some real tensions too. You know, you have to balance your own kind of demand projections, where the market is going when it comes to electric vehicle deployment and other technologies. How do you think about balancing that role as a consumer of these minerals and being kind of that anchor demand, as well as just making sure that you're responsible to your shareholders and the projections you're managing business on?
Yeah, it is a lot of time in risk planning, risk management, and collaboration as we make the decisions of who we partner with. You can imagine our vehicle development process is on a timing path where if it doesn't launch on time, you have a gap in the market. It tends to tie to big regulatory changes with the product enhancements that are needed for our products. And you have to turn off a plant to retool it, to build up the new products and then launch new products. So everything being on time matters. you have to share that accountability with the suppliers that you're investing in, that when they say they're going to make investments, they're going to progress down the validation of their products and the extraction and the quality of extractions and deliver the volumes that they need in a timely manner. And we're there to help them with all of our capabilities to, we know how to scale industries and we know how to scale processes. We do supplier development partnerships with them along the way. But we do monitor and plan a transition so we're not fully exposed at once across our full portfolio at any given time, which is why, being able to commit long-term contracts before you scale them across your portfolio is one of the tools we use to say, prove yourself, we're willing to start with you. And it's the consistent startup model of start small, scale fast. You have to start small, demonstrate capabilities, and then we'll scale you quickly thereafter.
Yeah, and then after that, you sometimes have to be creative. As EV demand has softened a bit, you've had to redirect some of these investments that you've made in battery storage towards grid scale, particularly with the shift of Ultium cells in Spring Hill. How has that transition played out? And I think for this audience, we can read the headlines that you're reorienting these supply chains to feed the data center demand, but what does that look like in practice with manufacturing, retooling, deployment timelines? And you're feeding a different end user, right? So what's that been like?
So it's actually been rewarding to start early and see the scalability of some of the industries we've been on and recognize and how affordability is driven by that volume. When we started with some of our EV platforms on build-in resiliency, whether it's battery raw materials or magnets and heavy rare earths or the rest of the critical minerals, we immediately started taking usage across all of our platforms, because this isn't an issue with EVs versus combustion engine. This is an opportunity across our entire portfolio. And in batteries, specifically, when we started seeing the EV demand taking a different shape than expected, we also recognized if we could build flexibility in our operations, we can actually broaden the use beyond the automotive industry, which is why we made the announcements in Spring Hill on storage systems where we're bringing in common chemistries that can run in similar operations without massive investment and provide the scale not just within the portfolio we control, but into energy storage systems that's growing. And if we think forward as we're developing future chemistries, we have a common need. We all want high energy density with the longest range, whether it's the amount of time you have that storage available for your operations in energy storage, or when you're driving a vehicle. We're really proud, for those that have seen the Cadillac Lyriq V outside here. It's got great range behind it. It starts changing your mindset with range anxiety. And our next chemistry with lithium manganese rich actually brings in more energy density, higher range, and more affordability altogether.
I want to shift gears a bit here to kind of another end of the supply chain in your manufacturing base. The automotive sector has seen deployment of different robotics tools on the factory floors. In 2024, 40% of robotics were used by the auto industry. Obviously, China's been building up a ton of capacity with incredible scale capabilities that they have at home. How do you consider these new types of risks in your factory floor and using these types of robotics tools? And is that kind of in the same vein of thinking as your upstream supply chain vulnerabilities?
Yeah, when we talk about relationships, they matter internal and external. And when we think of robotics, it starts with our people. And our approach to robotics is ensuring our core values around safety and quality, and then scalability. And so we are bringing in the robots to help create a more safe environment in collaboration with our employees. It helps drive quality and consistency into our operations. And then, it is scalable as we think about our operations around the world. And it is a huge factor in the next set of industry transformation that helps us build more affordable, higher quality vehicles and allows us to invest into a broader portfolio.
And your investments in the upstream, like MP Materials, could potentially produce the magnets for those robotics too. So it all comes kind of back together. You've given a ton of insight into what you can do for the critical minerals challenges, supply chains writ large, but obviously the automotive sector can't be our solution for everything. You use some of these materials in substantial quantities, so it makes sense for you to be as involved in the upstream, midstream as possible to secure supply, but some of them you're using like really tiny amounts. Your colleague Jasper always says yttrium in the LED lights in the cars as an example. What can the government be doing to support you in these kind of more bespoke, obscure mineral applications that you'll never kind of be that anchor demand for, and how is that partnership looking?
Well, I think it's really critical when you're building resiliency, when you're making any change across any industry, it's kind of that chicken and the egg, and you have to bring parties together to create the demand and supply at the same time, to help companies make their decisions around where they invest and where they apply their resources. And for us, in a great example, we invested in with MP Materials back in 2021. The auto industry is like 10% of the heavy rare earth usage in the world, and General Motors is like 1%. And you can say the same thing across semiconductors or any of the battery critical minerals. We tend to be like this 1%. And our mindset couldn't have been, we're only 1%, we can't make a difference, no one's gonna do it for us. We changed that to say, what can 1% do to help create scale as a foundational customer? And that foundational customer matters when it talks about using the partnerships and the relationships we have to create financing tools, to work with other industries, and support the companies we're making investments in. And to your point, the public and private sectors that have to come together to create incentives around the capital needs and financing of the resiliency that the country needs to have stability in our economy with the manufacturing sectors. And at the same time, bring together industries through policies to create the demand side for consideration. And I think when you start seeing those come together and the potential starts to rise, and you see these first movers that move forward with it, and they're reaping the rewards behind it because they saw that potential come together.
Okay, so last question. This room is filled with many miners, processors, and manufacturers of component parts of your vehicles. For your perspective as a buyer at the end of the supply chain, what do you need from this community that you're not getting? What would it take to become a partner to General Motors? And I know that you have a Supplier of the Year award that you give out. So what's it going to take to get a miner to be that Supplier of the Year?
So a couple things I would ask you to leave with. One, this transformation in supply chain resiliency is a one-time reset. And I do think with the tools available to create competitiveness, it will be sticky for a long time. What we do know is we are making strategic investments and partnerships with companies, and as we start down this development cycle and it validates its capabilities, we will create long-term relationships with them. What it also means is those that aren't taking the other early leap and those that aren't making the early investments will get left behind. And if you're not part of the first wave of creating resiliency, it will be difficult to build a scale and stay competitive. And so this is an industry, these are industries that once you fall behind, it is very difficult to catch up. At the same time, we also have high standards. As I mentioned, safety and quality are the foundation of our company. And so building processes and capabilities that allow you to operate in an efficient way with the quality that we need across industries and the grades of materials we need across industries is critical on what you bring to the table for consideration as we move forward. And you mentioned Supplier of the Year. This is our top 0.01 percentile of companies. And it's great to see how many of them will talk about General Motors was their first customer when they were small, and how quickly that partnership resulted into having these achievements of being rewarded across industries, across companies. Those are the companies we celebrate together and recognize as they achieve these milestones?
Well, I've learned a great deal. Procurement is really where we need to be focusing a lot of our attention alongside with kind of the strategy globally of supply chains. It doesn't matter if you're the 1% demand or if you're the smallest part of the supply chain, you have a role to play. Please join me in thanking Shilpan for his comments.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Much.